When politicians talk about trade, especially with other nations, they often mention tariffs. So what actually are these tariffs? Where do they come from? And what impact do they have on trade and the economy in general? Well, originally, when people first started to trade goods from one location to another, moving things overland was very slow and expensive. So generally, if you wanted to move something over a long distance, you needed to move it by boat. The items then were loaded and unloaded in a port, which for the most part was operated by the government which ran that country or area the port was actually in. However, transporting things by boat was still fairly expensive, and also dangers of pirates, storms, and loss and damage of goods whilst it being shipped from one location to another. It meant in general there was a limited amount of goods being moved, normally either luxuries or essential items that couldn't be found locally. So, for instance, historically, the southwest of England mined tin, the north coast of France made wine and brandy. So ships would sail from France to England with a cargo of wine and brandy, return with a cargo of tin. And the rulers of the country involved in the trade, of course, looked for some way they could get back the money involved in building the harbours and the ports, maintaining sea defences, patrolling the seas to keep them clear of pirates, and other associated costs. The easy way to do this was to tax the goods when they arrived in the ports. So people employed at the ports used lists of goods with the various charges that would be levied on the importation of each of these items on the list, or tarifa. You could say 1 coin for a bottle of wine, 100 coins for a barrel of brandy, or something similar. Now, of course, there was a temptation, once these tariffs had been set up, to use them to increase the amount of taxes that the government was bringing in. However, there were some limitations to this. If the tariffs were too high, merchants wouldn't make any money, so we tempted to sell elsewhere. Alternatively, the price that locals had to pay for the imported goods was too high, it could either slow down the economy, or alternatively, it anger the local population too much, might think about rebellion, for instance, if their tea was taxed too high a rate. So in general, government kept the level of tariff at a reasonable rate. However, as we moved into the industrial age, a lot of the elements that influenced tariffs started to change. Firstly, land transport, especially railways, made moving goods by land cheaper and easier. So goods produced at one end of the country could be moved as easily as importing the same goods from another country. Next, piracy was virtually eliminated. Improvements in navigation and ship construction, and there was less loss at sea. Now larger ships carried more cargo could be built. Finally, many of the ports and later airports were no longer being run by governments. Instead, they were run by companies who charged docking or landing fees to the ship owners. All of this meant there was a huge increase in the amount of goods being moved, both within a country and also between countries. So where did this leave tariffs? Well, for the most part, the initial reasons for having these tariffs were disappearing, or had even disappeared completely. However, with the increased volume of trade, these tariffs were now producing substantial amounts of income for the government, it would be difficult to replace by other methods of taxation. With land transport being much easier, also so many more places for most countries needed monitoring to collect all the tariffs that were due. Some people have suggested, though, that if these tariffs were abolished completely, that even more goods could be moved from one country to another, with particular goods being produced in whichever country best suited their production, and then being exported to wherever they were needed most. This, they argued, would then boost the growth in all the countries involved. Its general principle was called free trade. There was a counter-argument which said that unless the tariffs remained in place, or actually even increased in relation to some goods, then the people producing goods locally would be put out of business by cheaper imports from other parts of the world, where some of the costs of production were lower. Again, the general principle behind this was called protectionism. The result, normal politics, was a range of compromises which varied over time. Some countries entered into reciprocal free trade agreements, either with another country or even a group of countries. Then again, these could be for all of the goods or just a limited range of goods. Other countries just kept the tariffs at a similar level to their historic levels. Then, of course, there are other countries that introduced substantial increases in tariffs. This normally just over a limited range of goods. General justification for these increases was to protect this society from the dramatic disruption to key industries that would cause a particular sector of the economy suddenly flooded by cheap imports. The use of tariffs to stop or severely limit trade in a particular sector of the economy is often known as a trade barrier, since the increased tariff means that it isn't economic to trade those goods, and therefore trade in that particular sector virtually stops. However, as a result of increasing tariffs on goods from one country could mean that the other country responds by increasing tariffs in return. This could result in what's known as a trade war, especially if the levels of tariffs continue to rise. Trade wars generally have a negative effect on the economies of all the countries involved. There are, of course, many countries that have adopted a mix and match approach to tariffs, picking some or all of these options depending on which country they were trading with and what goods were being traded, and what the relationship was with the countries involved at the time. Due to a series of complex international problems, relations have occurred that need sorting over trade and tariffs, and there have been a number of bodies and international treaties that have tried to smooth the way. Two most important of these are the GATT General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, where an increasing number of countries try to come to an international agreement on reducing tariffs on certain goods. Then there's the WTO, or the World Trade Organization, which organizes GATT and also sorts out disputes between nations and generally tries to prevent trade wars from breaking out. Here's a quick look at tariffs.